Coming up on this episode of The Folklorist. A mysterious woman wanders the English countryside and into the aristocracy. 5 gold miners find themselves under attack by a group of strange creatures. And the seizure of arms by the British causes alarm in the American colonies. Journey with me now as we explore these fascinating tales on The Folklorist. Hello, friend. Welcome to The Folklorist. It was a chilly April evening in Almondsbury, England, when a cobbler came across a disoriented young woman wandering barefoot through town. She had a curious look about her and wore a high-collared dress with a black turban atop her head. It was unlike any attire the man had ever seen. He attempted to speak with her, but she gestured wildly, speaking a language that he couldn't comprehend. He thought the young lady was a vagabond, so he brought her to the home of the local magistrate, Samuel Worrall. He explained to him that the woman was acting rather odd. Mr. Worrall checked the woman's pockets for any documentation, but only found a counterfeit sixpence and quickly grew suspicious, as holding fake currency was a crime. But the woman seemed harmless to his wife, Mrs. Worrall, whose kind heart made her see the best in people. And so Mrs. Worrall, against her husband's wishes, arranged lodging for the mysterious woman at a local inn. The staff at the inn, however, shared Samuel's concerns as they observed her strange behavior. When they first entered the room, she took a particular interest in a drawing of a pineapple. She clearly recognized the depiction and exclaimed, "Anana! Anana! Anana!" After the innkeeper gave her a cup of tea, she covered one eye with her hand while chanting an unusual prayer, and when they showed her the bed, she appeared confused. They tried to show her how to use the bed, but she refused its comforts and insisted on sleeping on the floor. The next day, Mrs. Worrall returned to the inn and invited her to stay at their estate in Old Park. But the Worralls and their servants were startled by her indecent behavior, which clashed with their proper English manners. She continued to sleep on the floor and would dance wildly, sometimes without clothing. She refused to eat meat, drank only water and tea, and would fast every Tuesday. When roaming the grounds, she insisted on carrying a gong along with a bow and arrow, giving her a warrior-like appearance. But the most bizarre activity they observed was her weekly ritual, where she would chant from the treetops, "Allah Ta'ala!" It must be her supreme being. She was by far the most unusual guest Knoll Park had ever received. After several weeks, a doting Mrs. Worrall decided to have a wardrobe made up for her guest. But the mysterious woman selected the most exotic fabrics from the dressmakers, tying loose pieces and wrapping it around her in a tribal-like fashion. This once again confirmed Mrs. Worrall's suspicions that she was not European. But the question still remained: who was she? Time and again the family tried to uncover this mystery, until the day Mrs. Worrall finally made a breakthrough. After her countless attempts and a series of charades, Mrs. Worrall learned that she had arrived in England by ship. She provided her guest with a quill and was surprised to see her write down symbols from her mysterious language. "I am Mrs. Worrall." Mrs. Worrall then gestured to herself and motioned for her to do the same. After repeating this a number of times, the nameless woman suddenly broke down into tears. She then pointed to herself and managed to articulate a single word: Caraboo. Mrs. Worrall was elated. But not everyone bought the story. Mr. Worrall still remained unconvinced. She's an imposter, simply preying on our generosity. But he had yet to find any proof, so he decided to take her to court on the grounds that she had false currency in her possession. But no one was able to understand anything she said except for one word: Caraboo. So they brought her to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. When Mrs. Worrall found out, she was furious and quickly intervened, insisting that Caraboo rejoin them at Knoll Park. She was pressed to write down samples of her language and reproduce her entire alphabet. Mrs. Worrall thought she was starting to make sense of the seemingly incoherent language and sent samples to Oxford for translation. But the scholars simply dismissed Caraboo's bizarre symbols. "Dear madam, after careful study, I've determined these scribblings to be nothing more than humbug." But she refused to believe this, so she brought in her own specialists to interpret Caraboo's language. At first, they thought she was a fraud, but upon further examination, they began to notice something peculiar. They found that she spoke with the same inflection and consistently articulated each syllable in the same manner. No simple woman could possibly invent such an elaborate language. Why, these markings bear a striking resemblance to Hindi. Are you daft? She's clearly from the East Indies. Even though her words had similar characteristics to other languages, the experts couldn't decipher them, let alone agree on their origins, leaving the curious story of Caraboo a mystery. That is, until a Portuguese sailor named Manuel Eynesso arrived at Knoll Park. He listened intently to Caraboo and claimed that he understood her language. Finally, the Worralls had the answers they were looking for. According to Eynesso, Caraboo was a princess from the island of Javasu. Her father's land had been invaded, and during the attack she was abducted by pirates. She was taken on a long and dangerous voyage, where she managed to escape by jumping overboard into the Bristol Channel, where she swam safely to shore. Mrs. Worrall was thrilled and couldn't wait to spread the news about their royal guest and her incredible story of survival. Nobles, experts, and spectators from all over descended upon Knoll Park, entranced by the exotic princess. They provided her with elegant garments, painted portraits of her likeness, and threw parties in her honor. Even newspapers began printing her story. People couldn't get enough of Princess Caraboo, and she had even won over her biggest skeptic, Mr. Worrall. But her notoriety also attracted several cynics who made every attempt to discredit her. One charismatic gentleman tried to demonstrate that she could understand English by saying to her, "You are the most beautiful creature that I have ever beheld. You are an angel." But Caraboo never flinched and held her puzzled expression. Letters continued to pour in, inquiring about their sensational guest. One letter, however, took a far different tone. It was from a woman named Mrs. Neal, who claimed to know the true identity of Princess Caraboo. Mrs. Neal said that this princess was in her employ a few months earlier, and that she frequently entertained her children by speaking a fictitious language. She hoped the description was merely a coincidence, but agreed to meet Mrs. Neal at an undisclosed location and bring the princess with her. As Mrs. Worrall and Princess Caraboo waited in the parlor, Mrs. Neal stepped through the doorway and locked eyes with a stunned Caraboo. Mrs. Worrall knew all that she needed to know from Caraboo's expression and politely motioned for Mrs. Neal to leave the room. "Who are you?" "My name is Mary Baker, and I'm just a cobbler's daughter from Devonshire." Mrs. Worrall was devastated and wondered how she was able to fool virtually everyone. Well, it was simple. Since Mary spoke perfect English, she was completely aware of the attempts people made to expose her. But Mrs. Worrall demanded an explanation. Mary admitted that before she arrived in Almondsbury, she was desperate, begging in the streets, ignored by those passing by. But she observed that French lace makers wearing headdresses received more attention. This gave her the idea of wearing her black shawl around her head as a turban. And so her exotic transformation had begun. But in order to be successful, she needed more than a mere headdress to convince people. At first, she pretended to be French, until someone who actually spoke French confronted her. So she quickly changed her story, claiming to be Spanish instead. Even then, she found herself challenged by a supposed expert in Spanish. But he was an imposter as well, and pretended to understand her gibberish in order to impress his friend with his self-proclaimed command of the language. This experience taught her a valuable lesson, and she wouldn't make the same mistake a third time. She needed an identity, something no one could recognize. Perhaps a royal, but from where? The fictitious island of Javasu. And thus, Princess Caraboo was born. Mrs. Worrall was astounded at Mary's ability to keep up the facade for so long. She knew if word of this deception ever spread, the Worrall's reputation would be forever tarnished. So she bought a ticket for Mary aboard a ship bound for America, thus resolving this embarrassing situation. While her presence in America was well received, the public's fascination with Princess Caraboo had come to an end. And so in 1828, she returned to England, where she resumed her ordinary life as Mary Baker. Although Mary lived out her final days in obscurity, for one moment in time she was an eccentric royal that enchanted the upper class, who would remember their brief encounter with Princess Caraboo. Is there some folklore in your town? Well, let us know about it. Send us an email, folklorist@newtv.org. We'd love to hear about it. Did you know that during Princess Caraboo's voyage to America, it is said that her ship was blown off course and drifted to the island of St. Helena, where Napoleon was exiled? As the story goes, he was so taken by the imposter princess that he proposed to marry her. In the shadow of Mount St. Helens lies a canyon where a series of strange encounters have emerged over the past century. The first of these claims surfaced when a group of 5 seasoned miners headed out to the area on a seemingly routine expedition in search of gold. But what they found instead was something that none of the men could have ever anticipated. It's July 1924, and the team is working their promising gold claim with high hopes of striking it rich. And among the men was Fred Beck, who early on in the trip complained of a toothache. It was a long hike back, so he asked the most experienced woodsman in the group, Hank, if he would take him into town to see a dentist. But Hank refused to leave and replied, "Neither God nor the devil could get me away from here." And so the mining trip continued, with the men panning for gold day in and day out, taking refuge at night in their sturdy log cabin. Things were going smoothly. That is until one night when they heard strange whistling sounds echoing across the canyon. Although the men were accustomed to hearing noises at night, something about this sound was notably disturbing. Then, the following evening, they heard yet another unfamiliar sound, as if something was loudly thumping its chest. And pretty soon they all had an eerie sense that someone or something was watching them. This put the men on edge. Even Hank, who knew the land better than anyone, was becoming anxious. When they first arrived at the camp, he had noticed several large footprints scattered around the area, the likes of which he had never seen. Back then he thought nothing of it. Perhaps it was a bear. But now he was beginning to think it was something else entirely. The next day, Hank and Fred went to get water from a nearby spring and brought along their rifles just in case. And it was there that Hank saw something lurking in the shadows about 100 yards away. He yelled to Fred, who turned just in time to see a huge 7-foot hairy man-beast. Hank raised his rifle and fired off 3 shots, hitting the tree and spraying bark in all directions. The astonished Fred fired off several more shots, but the creature had turned and fled. When the shaken men returned to the cabin, they told the others of their terrifying encounter. "We gotta get out of here. There's some sort of mountain devil out there." "You sound like a madman."
"Ain't no such thing as mountain devils."
"Yes, there is. I saw it, and I shot my rifle at it, too." Hank and Fred eventually convinced the men to go, but now the sun was setting, and their last chance to leave had already passed, and so the men would have to wait until first light. All they had to do was make it through the night, and so they hunkered down and drifted off to sleep with their rifles in hand. Morning couldn't come soon enough. It was around midnight when a loud thud awoke the men. Something hit the cabin. Fred saw Hank kicking and screaming and tried to calm him down. "Quiet, quiet, be quiet." They heard heavy footsteps trampling through the brush right outside the cabin. Whatever it was huge, and there was more than one. The men readied their rifles, and then it began. What's that? Something's throwing rocks. And that's when the cabin began to shake, and a thunderous barrage of boulders rained down upon them. The hysterical men fired at the roof, the walls, the doors, until suddenly, everything went quiet. "Hold your fire!" The men looked at each other. Was the siege over? Maybe if we stop firing, they'll leave us alone. Hank squinted through a gap in the logs and saw several shadowy ape-like creatures passing by. He turned back to the group. I think they might be leaving. Suddenly, a large hairy arm reached inside and grabbed hold of an axe. Fred tried to wrestle it out of his clutches. Hank fired his gun. The creature released its grip and pulled its arm back out. The terrified men tried to regain their composure. But as soon as the arm withdrew, another assault began. The cabin began to shake violently, as if the creatures were trying to knock it down. The men wedged a post against the door, trying to secure it. Hank screamed incessantly and wildly fired his gun.
Begone, you mountain devils!
The entire night would go from a fierce battle to complete silence, over and over again. Fred and Hank led the charge, while the other men cowered in the corner. But as they waited for the next attack, Hank began to sing.
If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. And we'll all go home in the morning. And we'll all go home in the morning.
The night seemed endless, but soon, through the veil of smoke, Fred noticed a glint of light. Was it morning already? A welcome sense of relief swept over the men. The creatures had left. The attack was over. Somehow, they had made it through the night. The men grabbed only their essential items and cautiously exited the cabin with their guns drawn. Once outside, Fred spotted one of the monsters on a nearby ridge. He fired, hitting the creature, who toppled into the gorge.
Better them than us.
The men made their way out of the canyon and headed towards the nearest ranger station. Fred urged everyone to keep their ordeal a secret for fear of ridicule. But upon their arrival, Hank couldn't help himself and described their bizarre encounter to the ranger. Word quickly spread, leading to the great ape hunt of 1924, where people from all over swarmed into the canyon in hopes of catching a glimpse or perhaps even taking down one of the creatures. But their search was in vain, and no solid evidence was ever found. After the encounter, the area was renamed Ape Canyon, and Fred Beck would go on to tell the story of that night where he and 4 of his friends would be attacked by a pack of menacing beasts that some say may still be out there today. There's more to come on The Folklorist. Did you know there was another sensational Bigfoot encounter in 1924 when a Canadian lumberjack named Albert Ostman claimed that he was carried off by a Bigfoot while asleep in his camp? For 6 days, he was held captive in a cave by a family of ape-like creatures. He escaped by making the large creature drowsy after giving it snuff. Disclaimer: with folklore, sometimes the biggest casualty is fact. But please, keep watching. In the summer of 1774, temperatures in Boston were hot, and so were tempers. Citizens had defiantly protested a series of taxes imposed upon them, and the city was now occupied by an intimidating British force. The port was closed, commerce was at a standstill, and the prices of goods were rising. Rebellion was in the air, and the situation was reaching a boiling point. During this time, there were several places in New England known as powder houses, where the British and the colonists kept their stockpiles of gunpowder. And one powder house in particular sat just a few miles outside of Boston, in a town known today as Somerville. This arsenal was controlled by a man named William Brattle, who was loyal to the crown. Brattle noticed that the colonists from surrounding towns began taking possession of their gunpowder, but left the British powder behind. So on August 27th, he frantically wrote a letter to General Thomas Gage, commander of the British forces and the appointed royal governor of Massachusetts. In the letter, he disclosed the colonists' activities and implied that they could seize the king's powder at any moment. When Gage received the letter, he was concerned that the colonists were arming themselves during this volatile time. So he ordered Lieutenant Colonel George Madison to ready his troops and remove the remaining munitions from the Somerville powder house. But they had to complete the operation with the utmost secrecy to avoid a panic amongst the colonists. However, in his rush to leave the meeting with Madison, Gage dropped Brattle's letter. Little did he know the series of events this was about to ignite. On the morning of September 1st, 1774, British troops rode quietly up the Mystic River. Madison and his troops disembarked at Winter Hill, and from there they marched in formation until they reached the Powder House. When dawn broke, the soldiers entered the Powder House, and one by one they carried casks of gunpowder out on their shoulders, back to their longboats, and on to Boston. The precision in which the British had executed their mission completely stunned the colonists, but Gage had underestimated the massive backlash this action would cause. The following day, the Boston Post published Brattle's blabbermouth letter that requested the British seize the powder at the arsenal. A mob of angry colonists surrounded Brattle's home in Cambridge, forcing him to flee for his life. Tensions were now reaching a flashpoint, and some considered this blatant confiscation of their arms to be an act of war. But unsubstantiated reports were now circulating outside of Boston, claiming that 6 had been killed, many were wounded, and Boston was under bombardment. When Colonel Israel Putnam of Connecticut heard this, he raised 40,000 men and sent word out to local militia leaders. The country's peoples are being robbed of their powder as far as Framingham. Beg you will rally all the forces you can and be on the march immediately for the relief of Boston. Don't you think it's time to go? Boston! Boston! Within just one day, a wave of hysteria swept across the colonies, with the fervor entering every household. Women and children were making preparations for war, all the while urging their husbands and sons to fight for their liberties. Thousands of colonists were swarming into the area with pitchforks, muskets, knives, clubs, whatever they could find, ready to take back Boston. In order to protect Boston, General Gage moved his most experienced troops to the outskirts of the city. He then wrote to Parliament pleading for reinforcements. If you think 10,000 men sufficient, send 20. If 1 million is thought enough, give 2. You save both blood and treasure in the end. The situation was quickly escalating out of control. Colonist Joseph Warren, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, recognized that this could easily explode into a major conflict, the likes of which the colonies were not prepared for. He learned that the hordes of men rushing towards Boston were misinformed, lacking centralized leadership, and operating more like a mob than an organized unit. He also received intelligence that the British were sizably outnumbered, 10-1. But soon there would be no going back, and Warren knew that he had to intervene. So he rode out to confront the angry mob, pleading with them to turn back. The city had not been bombarded, nobody had been killed, and the British had no will to fight. He appealed to their common sense, and slowly but cautiously, the large mob dispersed. The crisis had been averted, so there would be no revolution today. After the event, Brattle acknowledged his betrayal and publicly begged for forgiveness. Upon the whole, the threatening I have met with, my banishment from my house, the place of my nativity, I am extremely sorry for what has taken place, and I hope that I may be forgiven. But the damage had been done. The colonists' lack of leadership and communication during the standoff exposed their vulnerability and motivated them to prepare for their imminent fight for liberty. Stores of gunpowder were now being carried off from forts and arsenals throughout New England and hidden away by the colonists. You see, the powder alarm was simply a dress rehearsal for the American Revolution, and soon a network of riders would ensure that the colonists would never again be caught off guard when they heard, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Did you know that in December of 1774, Paul Revere learned that the British were intent on seizing the gunpowder from Portsmouth, New Hampshire? He then rode his horse non-stop for 60 miles to warn the Patriots. This, of course, was the prelude to his historic midnight ride. An eccentric woman fools the upper class into thinking she's royalty. 5 gold miners escape the clutches of ape-like creatures and live to tell the tale. An explosive act by the British incites a revolution. These are the stories that are passed down through the generations. We are the Folklorists, and this is the new history. Till next time.